Welcome to the Word I Heard podcast, the podcast of Emmanuel Mennonite and our Emmanuel Mennonite youth YouTube channel. I almost said youth group channel. That's like a blast from the past for me.
Oh, we can be young at heart.
We can be young at heart. I'm Pastor Derek Hutchison. This is Elder Mark Fisher. And we gather each week to go over the sermon that I preached the week before. And we are making our way towards the end of the Sermon on the Mount, which we have had a series over the past, what has it been, Mark? It's been this is our fourth podcast, but I think it's been 5 weeks. And we're making our way towards the end of it. And last week, we were in the end of Matthew chapter 6, and I did a sermon on treasure. And I think I entitled it Buried Treasure.
Yes.
Again, I have my sermon in front of me. First sermon that I've done for the Sermon on the Mount that actually had a note page for it.
Yes.
And one thing that I didn't do when I started the sermon, and I was going to, but I knew that the sermon was going to go a little bit long, and it did. I could tell that my wife was getting antsy. She's always the one that kind of, does the whole, it's time to land it, Derek. It's time to... But I had a list to begin with of buried treasures that people talk about. And in my notes, I had the Ark of the Covenant is a treasure that Montezuma's treasure, Blackbeard's treasure, the treasure of Oak Island. I don't know if you've ever seen that. My wife's a big fan of the treasure of Oak Island. And then, of course, I don't know if you've ever heard of the Beale treasure. Mm-hmm. Have you ever heard it? It's a treasure that supposedly was buried by this individual and then wrote in the book this passage that you kind of had to.
Oh, yes.
You kind of had to understand to be able to go. But one of them that is my favorite treasure, and I'll take just a second. It's in a book called The Secret. Now, it's not the book The Secret that everybody's thinking about, Oprah Winfrey's secret, the whole idea of putting out positive thoughts. It's another book called The Secret. And what he did... This was back in the 80s. So he wrote a book called The Secret, and there are 12 treasures. And what he did was he went around the United States in public places, usually parks or something like that, and hid these casks. They're in plexiglass. It's in a kind of a pottery thing, and each one has a precious gem in it. So there are 12 precious gems. And then he hired a very famous painter and artist. And so there is a poem that goes along with, and then a picture. And in the picture are clues along with the poem to find these boxes. I don't know if you've ever seen, what's it called? Destination Unknown. Is it Destination Unknown, or is Josh Gates on? He's on the Discovery Channel. He's a big explorer, and he's really into. So out of the 12, in 40 years, 3 have been found.
Wow! And
that's my favorite treasure. I keep telling my son. I said, one of these days I'm gonna get that book. We're gonna take the summer, man. We're gonna go find it. And so. That's where my mind was when I started the sermon, was the whole idea of this buried treasure. Because in Matthew 6, we get to obviously the very famous one, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But obviously, store up your treasures in heaven. So I started with that, and I started the whole sermon with that idea of talking about this treasure. And as I moved through it, I got to this statement of perspective shapes our pursuit, and pursuit becomes our master, and our master determines the health of our soul. And so when you saw the title of the sermon, Buried Treasure, I started talking about treasure. What were your thoughts as the sermon started?
I thought about just searching for buried treasure, like you said, and so when I decided to read in the Bible the different things on treasure, it talked about the treasure, and when you talked about the what we, how'd you put it? What we put our heart on, that's our treasure.
Right.
And so it made me realize that the buried treasure isn't so much gold or silver, but it's what we value.
Yeah, and that was the whole thing that that Jesus comes to in this in this section of the sermon, where he talks about, for where your treasure lies, there your heart will lie. Yes. Also, and that whole idea of I made the comment in the sermon, the idea of Christine and I doing our Etsy thing and trying to find these little treasures, and the idea of there are three places that all things end up. They end up passed through our family for generations and generations, and that continues to do so. They end up in a museum, or they end up in a landfill. That's where everything we have will end up someday. And so what I wanted to try and get people to think about was, what's your treasure? What's the treasure that you have? Where does your heart lie? I talked about David Livingstone and being his body being buried in Scotland, his heart being buried in Africa, and asking that question of, where then does our heart lie? And so I kind of wanted to, in the idea of that treasure, start with, I kind of wanted to pick it out a little bit. When I said at the very beginning, perspective shapes our pursuit, what goes through your head when I say, or what went through your head when I started talking about that in the idea of treasure? What does it mean, or what did you think I meant? And maybe I can try and remember what I meant, but perspective shapes our pursuit.
Whatever we see as important, whatever we see as is worth spending our time and our life on, and so
or something that we call treasure.
Yeah,
that whole idea of what is important to us, and as I thought about that, I thought it really is. I'm a big I don't know what the word would be. I like the idea of perspective. That idea, I go and I speak to teachers and schools, and one of the things that I talk to them about is perspective. This idea of, how do we look at something? And I got to thinking about my perspective of looking at the things in my life and then trying to figure out in my life, what is my treasure? Because at least for me on the beginning, the first thing you think of is, okay, my bank account is my treasure, In my circumstance, not a very big treasure, but that's, we think of gold, of money, of these tangible things. How might a person, how do we change perspective?
It's thinking about what sort of things do we have that we can take with us to the next
phase.
Yes, to heaven.
Yeah.
And so it's realizing that the things that we hold on to. I'm a coin collector, and so I
Oh, are
appreciate
you?
gold
Okay.
and silver and copper, and more silver and copper than gold, of
Okay.
course. But even though I love to collect coins, it's partly for the historical value of it. I also see it as a way of getting out of debt. And so
Yeah.
I will buy when it's a little bit cheaper and sell when it's a little bit higher. And more often I buy and sell more when I have money to buy, and when I
Right.
sell when I need to
Yeah.
get some debt
Yeah.
taken out. And so it's really looking at physical treasure as a means to provide for ourselves and for others, but also if we can use those things for the kingdom. And so it's realizing that the things that we hold on to and value here, will those things exist in heaven? And so that when you mention people are a treasure, they are, because we have something that's eternal in us.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, because I actually said that in the sermon and you caught that. That was interesting, because that's one of the points that I was trying to make in the sermon is let's look at God's treasure. And God's treasure is his people.
Yes.
I mean, that's the thing. And so if I look at my life and look around my life and say the people in my life, the people I come in contact with, the people that I interact with on a daily basis, if those God's people, if I can change my perspective to get an understanding that that's God's treasure, and so that should be my treasure as well, then it, as I said, it shapes my pursuit. That thing that I said, okay, I may not go after this. Maybe I'm going to change my pursuit because of my perspective, and I go after this. And so how then do I use my other treasure to make a difference in the lives of those treasures? Because I think this is such a loaded scripture, because the word treasure to me is so broad. It's so broad that Jesus is talking about a lot of things. And the first thing we want to think is he's talking about our financial resources. And he is. He's talking about giving. What does giving look like? And how then do we, what is our treasure here on earth? I thought it was interesting as I was doing my research for it. I learned why the people who were listening to this, the audience, Jesus' audience at this time, would have immediately caught on to this, because in their time, their savings mechanism was to bury their treasure in a field. We think of the scripture that says, the parable that Jesus talks about, where a man goes along, finds a field, finds a treasure, immediately goes, sells everything that he has, and buys the field. But they would have known what he was talking about, this buried treasure. Now, we don't put a lot of our stuff in mason jars and bury them under the porch, although I've done that before. Some people do.
Yes.
But the idea of buried treasure immediately evokes a sense of excitement, I think, or it should.
Yes.
And this idea of possibility and promise and financial gain and notoriety and all those, I found the buried treasure. And I think that's all of those things are what Jesus is trying to say is, it's about all of your things. It's about giving. It's about people. It's about your treasure of the study of the Word. It's your relationship with God. Those are the things that I want you to pay attention to. And just like when the whole Sermon on the Mount, he's trying to shape us to look a certain way. And so he's saying what you look at, the way that you think is the way that the things that you'll pursue. Now, agree or disagree with the next one. The things that we pursue become our master.
I agree.
You think that's the case?
Yes, and that's where we need to ask ourselves really on a fairly often, fairly frequent basis, what are we pursuing? Because it's most type of things we can look at it once, but then life will consume us, and we're back in the grind. And so it's good to ask ourselves from time to time, what am I pursuing? What am I spending my time on? And is it providing for my family? Is it things that's taken away from the bigger treasures? And if we spend time with our spouse, our kids, or grandkids, then those are treasures that we know we're storing up treasures in heaven. But if we spend all our time on the pursuits here that will be destroyed or be left here, then we're building up earthly savings accounts, and those ones we're not going to take with us.
Right. And I tried to be very careful in the sermon in talking about, or at least mentioning, what Jesus, because we've talked about this in the Sermon on the Mount too. One, what was Jesus saying? And then the other part is, what is he not saying? And he's not saying that it's bad to have a car. It's bad to have a house. It's bad to have some money in the bank. I don't think he's looking at you and I and saying, well, he's definitely not looking at me and saying all of the fancy things that you have. But that's not really his point. His point is, or at least a point is it your master? Because he goes on, to talk about the idea of you can't serve two masters. You'll hate the one and love the other, love the one, you can't serve two masters. You have to have, you have to serve one thing. So he's very cautious, I think, in making the point of it's not bad to have money. You just can't serve money. Those things that call our attention away from God. And one of the things that I think I skipped as time got short, probably as I was doing the sermon, you probably saw me flipping a couple pages as those things got left out. One of the things that I wanted to say, and you coming from, a social worker, counselor perspective, I'm curious if you agree, disagree, see this a lot, experience this, or agree with this, is one of the things that I wanted to say in relationship to the master idea was this. When we are at our lowest, when things are at its worst, when we think there is no other way we can turn and there's no other place that we can go, the thing that we turn to first and most often, that's our God. Is that true, or is it a platitude, or just probably not a platitude, but some sort of just nice words that you put together? Is that true?
It can be, and it also can be when things go well. We find ourselves feeling like we're in control. We easily get distracted. But when all of our self-confidence, all our pride has been stripped away, sometimes we realize that we can't bail ourselves out.
There's nowhere else to go.
And so it can show what's our treasure, but sometimes it can help bring us back to our treasure, because all of a sudden
that's an interesting thought.
We're all the bells and whistles, all the things that distract us have been ripped away, and it's just us and God. Just us and our empty vessel, realizing that, okay, I don't have what it takes.
Yeah.
And so it can show us what's really important, but sometimes it could bring us back to what's important.
Yeah. I wrote a book not too long ago, and it kind of chronicles some very difficult, horrible things that happened in my life, some wonderful things that happen. But one of the things that I talk about is the very thing that you're mentioning, is the idea of getting to a place that it feels like there is nowhere else to turn. And I learned two things from those. In that rubric of when things are horrible, when things go, they're very worse, the thing that you turn to, the thing that you look for solace, the thing that you look to bail you out, that's your God. One thing that I found out was I turned to myself. And if I put myself in that rubric, then in a very selfish way, I became my own God. I can fix this. I can do this. I can pull myself out of this. And that then over time moved me to the place where I realized I can't fix this. I can't pull myself out. And that very realization then turned my attention to, okay, God's that's the only thing that I have. And I learned two very important truths. Probably the things that I would say, these are the only two things that I know for absolute certain 100% positive. There is a God, and I'm not him. That's what I learned. And so that point that you make of it being a positive turn as well rings true. And so there is this idea of our perspective shapes our pursuit. This pursuit that we have then becomes our master. And you can use another word. You can use addiction. You can use obsession. You can use whatever, distraction, whatever that word is. And then it gets it to the end that says, then that master that we have determines the health of our soul. Agree, disagree, too much? Off base? What do you think?
I think it's spot on. Whatever we serve, that's what's going to serve us. That's what's going to provide for us. And earlier when you talked about what we pursue when things go hard, sometimes even then, like you mentioned, at the first you used your own resources. And I remember in my journey when I was unemployed, I did the same thing. I just tried harder.
Yeah.
And finally I realized that what I was doing wasn't cutting it. So maybe it's what we first go to, and then sometimes we have to hit bottom before we finally realize that, okay, insanity is trying the same thing over and over, but expecting different results. But we tend to just try it harder. If it's not working, I'll just try it harder. And
that seems to be my mantra. That was very much so. That's hitting it. Is spot on. That idea of it's not working, try harder.
Elijah, when he was confronting the Baal, the prophets, and they were trying to get their God to light the fire, and he said, you're not loud enough. Scream louder. And,
that's it.
But that's what we do. We think we're civilized, but when we serve our gods, which sometimes is us, we just try it harder and think, okay, I'm just not trying hard enough.
And like you said with insanity, doing the same thing over, just doing it harder.
Yeah.
And thinking, why isn't this working? Why can't I pull myself out? Who is my master?
Yes.
And that whole idea then, what it is that we then define as our treasure, what we serve. I like that what you said, what we serve then serves us. It's this cyclical thing that keeps going. As it serves us, we serve it more, and it becomes our obsession, our addiction, or whatever you want to call it. And as we do that, it either fortifies and lifts up our soul, or it deteriorates it and destroys it. And so you get to the end of, I'm always fond of this Latin phrase, post hoc ergo propter hoc, and what it means is after it, therefore because of it, which means something happened after something, therefore what happened before is the thing that caused it. It isn't always true, but some cases It is, and so if we take the ends of this statement, this basis of my sermon, and go from one end to the other, can we then say our perspective, the way that we look at our worldview, our theology, our biblical, whatever you want to call it, that perspective then determines the health of our soul? Is that too big of a leap? Or can we say, like through geometry, what's that called? If A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. Can we say and fill it in and say then that our worldview determines the health of our soul?
It does, but it needs to come from a head affirmation to lived out. And so the good thing about that is if our worldview gets warped, we can correct, we can get back on track. And so as we keep going a certain direction, we find ourselves on autopilot, and that could be good if we're headed the right direction. But if we're falling off course, and like a ship, we can steer the rudder a little bit to get back on course. And so it doesn't always have to be a total 180. It may just be a little tweaking. Although if we get far enough off, we may need to totally turn around and go the other direction.
I remember telling a story in a sermon one time of a ship going in a long distance, and it was off by like a third of a degree. It was imperceivable. But over the long distance, over the long haul, it had taken, you take that small little error and take it out over that lifetime, over that distance. And without course correction, by the time you get to the end, you're way over here and wondering what happened. And that we studied that before in the sermon that Jesus gives earlier, the idea of, so you got to be perfect. Be perfect. And so there's those little tiny things that Jesus talks about. In there, we have a few minutes left, and I wanted to get to the next section. And the next section that Jesus talks about then is, in most Bibles, it's titled this section, Don't Worry. How realistic is that when Jesus says it to these people? Is it, obviously Jesus is saying it, so it holds some weight. But is it any more lofty today? I mean, when somebody comes up to you and says, oh, this is, you say to somebody, this horrible thing is happening. And they say, you know what? Don't worry. It's going to be okay. Is that solace, or is that just platitude, or this bromide that people say to get you to... To me, it's like saying, coming up on somebody, how you doing today? Good, how are you? This could be the worst possible day I've ever had. I could be in a terrible situation, but I just told you, I'm doing good, how are you? This thing that doesn't hold any weight. How do we get past, don't worry, be happy, to the point of, okay, I'm not worried. You're the counselor. I come to you. I can't stop worrying. What do I do?
To stop worrying, it's not a passive thing. It's not just a matter of shutting something off. It's as you shut something off, you've got to turn something on. And so in not worrying, it's asking God to guide us in what he would have us do, asking God to guide us in what he wants us to give to him. And so the not worrying isn't passive. It's something where we really have to be active and to take hold of what we're called to take hold of. But Jesus says his yoke is easy and his burden is light. And we tend to carry a yoke and a burden that's beyond our ability to carry.
Yes.
So it's knowing, what burden does God want me to bear? And if that burden that we're bearing is a joy, then that's the burden we're supposed to bear. But if it's causing us to worry and be anxious, which saying don't worry, well, that's
doesn't-
worrying is like breathing. I mean,
Right.
it's natural, and so not worrying is going from the natural to the supernatural. Not
Right.
worrying is something that we have to take by the horns and say, okay, yes, I'm worried, but I know God's got this. And so
Yeah.
then it's asking God, okay, God, is this something that you're going to guide me through? Is this something where you're going to just have part the Red Sea and have me walk on through? How
Right.
are you going to rescue me? And so sometimes
Right.
in these situations, I start to think, okay, the times I've asked God to help me in the past, God would help me every time, not right away. And quite often the solution wasn't what I expected.
Or
But-
wanted.
Well, God tends to keep it in place just enough to keep our
Okay.
trust in him, but to leave it to a point for we will know he's got it. And that's where we need
Yeah.
our Ebenezers, our places of remembrance.
Right.
How has God rescued me in the past, and how is he going to do it now? And so in our not worrying, that's when it's good to look to the past and look how
Right.
God has rescued me,
Right.
rescued us.
Is worry an emotion? What is worry? Is worry an emotion? Is it a reaction? What is it?
It's really our desire to take control of something. When we worry, we want to feel like somehow we need to
Yeah.
fix it. We need to be felt sorry for because we're in a bad situation. And
Right.
and so worry is a very natural thing. Being anxious is just natural, although worry tends to be more focused on a specific situation, and anxiety is more focused on just feeling anxious, not really
Right.
knowing how things are going to turn out. So it's harder to pin it down. But
And I think that's the perfect thing, because that was the thing that I used in the sermon, and I said in the sermon, and it might have struck a chord with people. It might have ticked some people off. It might have made some people look at themselves and say, oh, I think I might have to take a look at myself a little bit. Was that idea of worry is about control. I need to control my situation. I need to control my surroundings, just like you said. And when I lose that control, it throws me off. And so, you know, what Jesus is reminding us here with the birds in the air and the lilies of the field, as he talks about through 25 and through the end of chapter 6 in Matthew, is that idea of, I want you to get to a place where you've looked around, your perspective says, hey, God takes care of these things. And so then my first reaction isn't worry. My first reaction is assurance, is hope. That not that it's going to be fine, but that no matter what happens, it'll be fine. And I think that's where we get, I think what we do is we have a tendency in our limited study of the Word and actually looking at it to cherry pick a lot. And it confuses us. For example, I can cherry pick and confuse probably a number of people by using the verse that you used. Jesus said, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. But be perfect.
yeah,
You know, and I can take those two and say, that's not easy. That's not light. Being perfect is that. And so I can confuse. And I think what we do with this one is we say, Jesus said, don't worry. So I'm not going to worry. And we don't lay the groundwork. We don't have the foundation that keeps us from immediately reacting like that. So what we say is, okay, Jesus said, don't worry, but things are still going bad. It didn't get fixed. And so what we think is, he takes care of the birds. He takes care of the lilies. They eat. They're fine. I'm going to be fine. And then when it's not fine, we lose it. What happened? Did I not pray hard enough? So I do things harder and I try harder. And then we get to the point of God's not fixing this. I better take over. And that's the cycle that we look. I've changed my perspective. I've changed my pursuit. My master has changed and my soul is feeling it. And that's the whole idea of really not looking at what Jesus is saying and sometimes taking it and using it for our own gain, I guess, is that whole idea of don't worry. And I think what was interesting, I just wanted to bring this out. It's a little thing. As he's going on, he's saying, "Oh, you of little faith, so do not worry, saying, what shall we eat? Or what shall we drink? Or what shall we wear? Your Father knows that you need them, but seek his kingdom and his righteousness, and all things will be given to you as well." I think what's interesting is, and it's very subtle, Jesus doesn't say, what if we eat? What if we drink? Not that I'm not going to get it. He's saying, what shall we drink? What shall we eat? And this idea of saying, I'm going to provide for you. But just like you said, it may not be your timing. It may not be your answer. But if I come up with it, it's better thing. And that's has always been my mentality. If this is God's will and plan for my life, even though it may not match what I think, and I may have a tendency to worry about it, really? You want me to go that direction, that road? Any plan that Jesus and God comes up with has got to be better than mine.
He sees the big picture. We just see what's around us, and with it not worrying, there's things He wants us to do instead. And what you read about seeking the kingdom. So rather than worrying, we seek after God and His ways, and so it gives us a way through that. Later, Paul talks about don't worry about anything, but with prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, give God your requests, and He'll give you His peace. And so it's not enough not to worry. We got to do something about that worry. Yeah. And so it's rather than trying to shout it out of the harder we try to push out of our head, the louder it gets. So rather than trying to focus on not worrying, it's okay, but what do I do with that worry? And I know that as Jesus was preparing this sermon, He was thinking and looking all the way down through time, thinking, at some point in time, Derek's going to do a sermon series on this. I'm going to make it as difficult as I possibly can, because we sit here and talk about this, that don't worry. It may not end up like you want, but God will be at work. You may not get what you want. It may not be the timing that you want. It may not be anything you want. And then He says, sit down and write the next sermon, Derek, where He says, knock, ask, seek. Whatever you ask will be given to you. And so now I've got to deal with the people who cherry pick that says, ask God for anything and you'll get it. And it's the difference between what Jesus said and what He meant. And so we get to that next week, is the idea of ask and it'll be given. Yeah. I can tell you that isn't always the case. Well, from my perspective. And He also says that you don't receive because you're asking out of the wrong motives. And so exactly. Our asking has to be in line with His. Right. And so it's rather than trying to persuade God to join us, we're trying to find a way to join God in His ways. And so when we change our perspective, then we can realize that even if it's not what we want, it's what we need. Yeah. God knows what's best. And so if He's not answering it like we want, it's not in His timing. And so it's getting close to Him and saying, okay, God, what do you have for me? What journey do you want me to walk along with you in? Right. And so it's the journey, knowing that it's as important, if not more important than the destination itself, is that walking with God, and knowing that we may not understand Him. Half the time we don't even understand ourselves. How can we understand Him? I know it. But we know we can trust Him. Yeah, that's exactly right. And so that takes us to at the end of chapter 6 and brings us to the last chapter for the Sermon on the Mount, which will be over the next. Let's see. It's going to be in 3 weeks. Wow. We're going to talk about. Next week we'll be talking about the sermon title, "Knock Knock Who's There,"
Then we're going to talk, which I'm looking forward to, the sermon after that. So if you enjoy the podcast, stick with us, because in 2 weeks, we'll be talking about false prophets, how you see them, how you recognize them. And next week, and I'll give you a little taste of what we're going to be talking about on the podcast next week, because you're going to hear it in this sermon in a couple days. It doesn't get any easier, Mark, because what we're going to be talking about is judging. How do we judge and not be judgmental? And so I'm working on that one right now, and I can tell you there are a lot of landmines, there are a lot of holes that you can fall into, and you can cherry pick the next section to death and make it fit whatever you want. So next week we're going to be talking about not only, knocking and Jesus answering, but the idea of how do we judge as Christians. And so that one will be interesting, and hopefully we'll get some comments. If you're watching it on YouTube, you can go down and leave a comment down at the bottom. We'll try and get back to you if we can. If you like the podcast, share it with other people, and join us each week as we right now go through this Sermon on the Mount and try and figure out what in the world Jesus is trying to say to the people of that day and to us specifically. So for Mark, for myself, for everybody here at Emmanuel Mennonite, we want to encourage you to come join us, worship with us on Sunday morning, 9:30 a.m., as we continue to look at the Sermon on the Mount, and each and every week try and discern the word we heard. So thanks for listening. We'll see you next week. God bless.